Yes guys, welcome back to another video from 2Easy Labs. And today we'll be taking a look at 2Easy Sliders, a premium power-up found in our Webflow app. First, we'll deep dive into the slider setup and we'll also compare and highlight its key features. Let's dive in. Okay, there's only a few steps we need to take to set up a basic slider. So on my page, I've already created a section with a container inside. Now let's add a div block and we'll call this slider wrap. All our other slider elements we nested inside of this div. Now if we come across to our docs, we want to apply a custom attribute name of te-slider. Great. The next step is to add the slider track. This element will contain each of our individual slides. Let's come back to the docs and copy and paste this attribute name onto this element. Now let's add some style to the slider track. We need to set this to flex with a direction of horizontal and a flex gap of 0. We'll be using padding and margin spacing to separate our slides. Next, let's create our first slide. I'll call this slider track item, and we'll set the width here to 25%. Inside this, I'll place another div called slider card, and inside we'll add a visual as well as a body area with a title. Okay, so now our first slide is complete. Let's copy it and we'll click on our track div here. Let's copy it and we'll click on our track div and create several duplicates inside. Now we need to come back to our slider track item and ensure the flex sizing is set to don't shrink or grow. And we're going to add some padding inside each track item to separate our slides. And to counterbalance this on the track, we'll also add a -1 rem value. And finally, let's set the overflow to hidden on our slider parent wrap. We should now have everything we need in place for this slider to function. So let's hit publish and see what happens. Awesome, the slider's working great. We can swipe left and right and move between slides like so. Now that we've created a basic slider, let's add some controls. So let's open up our navigator and we'll pin that to the side. All of our controls need to be nested inside of our slider wrap class, which has the custom attribute of te-slider. So let's place a div below our slider and add a class of slider controls. We'll set this to flex horizontal space between and a flex gap of 2 rem. Let's also create some separation between our slider track and our controls by adding some top margin. Now if you scroll down the page, you'll notice we've already created some pre-made elements here. The first is our slider's left and right arrow buttons. So let's place both of these inside the same div. And we'll add a display of flex horizontal so they sit next to one another. Next, let's grab our slider pagination element and paste this inside our controls wrapper too. If we switch tab to our slider docs and we open the next previous accordion, we can copy these two attributes and add them to each of our arrows. Next, let's set up our pagination. We need to apply a custom attribute name to the parent wrapper that contains our pagination dots. Once again, we'll copy this value and paste it as a custom attribute name. And before I move on, something to note here, if we click on the first pagination dot, you'll see we've applied a combo class of is-active. We can use this combo to style our pagination's active state. In this example, we've updated our dot background and outline color. So let's come up and publish the page. And we can now use our controls to move through our slides. Now you'll probably notice a ton of pagination dots here, and this is counting all the slides that are inside the track and not the group of slides that are currently in view. We'll be showing you how to fix this in the options chapter later in this video. But for now, it looks like this is working as expected. Let's head back to our project and add some more controls. Next, we have a counter that displays the current slide and also the total slide number. So we'll copy the attributes from the docs and place this on the text element we want to display our current slide number. And we'll do the same again on the text element we want to show total slides. So let's publish the page, refresh, and we can see as I swipe, the counter is responding. For a design like this, the best practice would be to group our slides, which we'll get onto shortly. The last control we'll look to set up is a horizontal scroll bar. So like our other controls, we've already styled this element with an overflow of hidden, position set to relative, apply to fixed height, and some padding. Inside of this wrapper, it's essential we include two things, the thumb and the thumb handle. The handle is the element the user can click and hold to navigate between slides. All we need to do here is to add an attribute name of TE slider scrollbar to the parent element for this to work. So let's go ahead and publish our page again. And I'm now able to click and hold to move between slides. The thumb will also automatically move to indicate our current slide position as I use other controls. One of the more handy features of Too Easy sliders is the ability to create button navigations that link to individual slides. So here we already have a basic slider set up with 4 slides inside. Let's add a slider navigation underneath. I'll insert a div and give it a class of slider nav. Inside of this div, we'll place another and apply a class of slider nav track. You'll notice we're following the same structure as in our previous setup example. Inside the track, we have our slider nav track items. The last step here is to create our slider nav cards. So let's add a visual and a text label inside this card. Now with the card design finished, let's duplicate this 4 times to match the number of slides in our main slider. Let's now set the nav track to flex horizontal center, and we'll add some padding left and right to separate each nav item. Now if we come back to our main slider list and set the overflow to auto, we can make note of which slide contains a what image. We can also now copy paste these images into our nav cards like so. And once we're done, we'll set the overflow back to hidden, and let's update the text here. Now let's head back to our navigator, and we need to make sure that our main slider and our nav slider are siblings. If we nest the nav inside the main slider, it won't work. So let's come over to the docs and open up the setup accordion, and we can copy the attributes we need here. So let's add TE slider with a value of nav. Let's also add a track attribute. And let's adjust the speed to 0.8. Awesome. The navigation buttons are now working. However, they are aligned left. In this design, we want them centered. So what we need to do is apply a custom attribute name of TE slider alignment with a value of center. Okay, so this should fix our issue. Now let's hit publish and see. If we refresh the page, the navigation buttons are now aligned to the center. The next step is to set up our navigation's active states. Let's come back to our project and select our nav card. We'll come across to the slider docs, copy the attribute name, and add a value of the class name we want to use as our active state. Let's use a combo class of is-active. Now let's add this attribute to all of the nav cards. Great. Next, let's create the combo class isActive and apply some styles to this. So we'll set the opacity to 100%, and for the default style, we'll set the opacity to something like 30%. You can see as we move through each of our slides, a navigation active state is now present. The only problem here is, at the moment, the transition between active states feels a little sudden. So let's fix this by adding a transition effect to our slider nav card. Let's go with a duration of 350 milliseconds. Now if we switch back to our live page and hit refresh, we can see the transition is in place. We can also set up this navigation to work with longer lists. For example, we can give our track a fixed width to show 2 of the 4 nav cards. If we head to the publish page and swipe through our slides, you'll notice our navigation intelligently keeps the active slide in view. We can also swipe through our navigation to move through the card list items. Sometimes the design requires our navigation buttons to sit on top of our main navigation. This can pose a challenge as the slider nav must always remain a sibling. We can get around this by placing both of our main slider and our navigation inside a wrapper with a position of relative. Next, we can set the position of the slider nav to absolute bottom and add some padding. Let's also set the click events on this div to none and the individual nav cards to auto. This will allow us to swipe left and right of the nav. Now let's come up and hit publish. And there you have it. Okay, so next let's take a look at the different options you can apply to the parent wrapper to affect how your slider behaves. Let's open up the navigator and we'll head to our master wrapper that has the slider track and controls inside. Now let's open up the settings tab, and the first option I want to demonstrate is called slides per view. Essentially, this allows you to group multiple slides together. Right now in our example, you can see the slides are moving one by one when we swipe or use our controls. This is throwing our pagination and our counter out of whack. For this design, a better idea would be to group all 4 of these slides together. So let's come on over to the docs and copy the slides per view name value. And we'll add it into our slider. Now we have the option of adding a value of auto. This is based on whatever we set our slide width to. We can also add a value of percentage. We can add a numbered value, or we can add a number array. Let's go with auto and we'll paste it into our custom attribute value field here. Let's now publish the page and hit refresh. You'll notice our pagination has been updated and there are 4 slides grouped inside of the one. Next, let's add an infinite loop effect. Let's open up our loop accordion here, copy our attribute name, and we can apply a value of true or false. In this example, let's set the value to true. Now let's see what happens. As you'd expect, we can now continuously swipe left to keep moving through our slider. Obviously, a scroll bar may not be the best design choice for this design, but overall the effect looks great. Let's now add an autoplay function to this slider. We'll add a custom attribute of tslider autoplay and add the value we want in milliseconds. And let's hit refresh and we can see our slides switching automatically. Another useful feature is the freeze scroll option. Now if we head to the live page, you'll notice that when I swipe, the slides no longer snap. It glides and then rests depending on your swipe velocity. This can be a really nice effect for timeline sections and other components. We also have an option to change our transition type. By default, this is set to slide. Let's apply a fade transition here instead. I'll copy the name attribute and insert a value of fade. And you can now see this behavior reflected here. Now, if we want to adjust the speed at which it fades or slides, we can add a custom attribute of tslider speed. And we can insert a value between 1 and 0.1. The higher the number, the faster the transition. So let's go ahead with a value of 0.5. And if we publish the page, we can see that this has now slowed down our original transition speed. Let's now create a slider using CMS content. So we've already created a collection here with 4 items inside with an image uploaded for each. So what we need to do is keep the slider wrap as is, insert a collection list onto our page, switch the source to reference our slideshow collection, and we'll copy and paste a class of slider track onto our collection list. We'll next add a custom attribute name of tslider track, exactly the same as in the above example. And we'll also add a class of slider track item to our collection list item. Finally, let's go ahead and paste our slide card inside. Next, let's delete the static track and move our collection list inside of the slider wrap, which already contains our custom attributes. And we'll connect to the CMS nodes like so. And right now there's only 4 slides inside this collection. So let's hit publish and see what happens. And right away you can see our counter and pagination are only displaying 1 item, and the arrows and scroll bar have disappeared. This is because all of our 4 slides are currently in view. So let's now come back to the designer and add another slide to the CMS. We'll duplicate this item and upload another image. If we come back and hit publish, we'll notice our slider controls are now visible and a slide has automatically been generated. This is a really useful feature as it allows clients to auto-populate new slides using the CMS instead of relying on designer mode. So let's now add another 3 items in the CMS and hit publish. More slides have now automatically been created.